Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. So this is our career panel today. So the format of this is going to be very simple. I'm basically going to be your MC, and the whole time is basically going to be for you to ask questions for these four panel members. But before we do that, I'm going to start by asking each of them to introduce themselves and give a brief history of their time in academia and or industry and kind of how they came to be here today. So I'm just going to start here with Jen, and you can just pass my comment.
Okay, sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. Some of you probably saw me earlier this morning give a talk. So Jen Forsyth, I'm an assistant professor in the psychology department here at UW. I just wrapped up my third year of having my own independent lab. So my PhD was in clinical psychology, but as I indicated, I've always been interested in mechanisms. So have done some training in neuroscience and genetics along the way. My postdoc especially was really focused on functional genomics and genetics experience. And then I did 3 years as a postdoc, got a K award while I was a postdoc, transitioned to faculty at UCLA where I was at the time in psychiatry for a little bit before I moved here. I believe that's a good overview.
Hi guys, I'm Stephanie Noble. So I actually just finished my first year as assistant professor at Northeastern, so very new to this world. I've had kind of a circuitous journey myself. So I was a chemical engineer undergrad, and I thought I would be really interested in protein folding, but never interested in academia. So I actually co-founded a startup company called Go Blue. And in that company, I realized I was really interested in methodology development. So I started my PhD, and then I went into a postdoc. I also got a K99 or 00 to support my transition to a faculty. So I'm happy to talk to anybody who's interested in, entrepreneurship or academia or kind of, that line between psychology and engineering.
Protein folding, I didn't know that. So hi, I'm Anisha. I got my PhD at UCSF Berkeley, and I studied neuroimaging for multiple sclerosis. So a lot of like computer vision, finding those MS lesions, doing that at scale with a human in the loop system. So this is kind of something that I've always been excited about. How can humans and computers work together well? I did a postdoc here with Ariel. Yay, awesome. It was a wonderful time. I highly recommend the eScience Institute. After that, I did a brief stint in the Child Mind Institute as a research scientist, and then I went to industry. And at industry, I was actually doing neuroimaging for multiple sclerosis at scale. So like, it was such an easy transition because it was like, oh, I already did this in my PhD and now I do the same thing, but get paid more. So I thought that was great.
Living the dream.
Living the dream. So I worked there for 4 years. And then 3 months ago, I was like, I'm done with this. So now I do protein stuff.
Oh, hey.
Yeah, protein folding.
So all of you out there who want to do protein folding.
Yeah, it's really great because, I didn't realize that, I've been so focused on neuroimaging and neuroimaging methods for so long. I didn't realize that I actually could get a job outside of it, like as a data scientist. But it happened now. So I'm happy to talk about the whole job hunting process and knowing absolutely nothing about protein folding and yet getting paid to do it. So that's cool.
Hi, I'm Anshul. I work as a technical program manager at the eScience Institute within a center called the Scientific Software Engineering Center. I am far along in my career than everybody here, but I graduated in 2020 with an undergraduate in economics and math, and then I worked in industry actually, working the phones at a healthcare company that did remote patient monitoring. Then I worked on the product side with engineers, and then I worked at a research center at Northwestern studying gun violence prevention. And I split my time between the field and as a research programmer. A lot of the problems that I faced there as someone who didn't feel supported as a software engineer in research, I got to address now in my new role at ESSEEK, where we hire folks from the industry to build open source tools for academics in a variety of different situations. They could be in a nonprofit, they could be here at UW, or they could be in the universe of our funder, Schmidt Sciences, who kind of put something out on a listserv and we source projects. And I get to do industry adjacent work, but within a kind of a softer and more welcoming culture of academia, which I appreciate.
Okay, so clearly our goal here has been to put together a panel of people who have a variety of experiences, both in academia and in industry, so that you all can ask questions. And that's what the rest of this is for. So Please, for those of you on Zoom, I obviously can't see you raising your hand, but just shout out over the, or if you see them on the screen, please let me know. But otherwise, if you have a question for anyone on the panel, or for everyone on the panel, raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question for Stephanie. So I'm really interested in starting a business, but I don't really know how to approach that. Like, how do you figure out what is kind of missing in the fields? And especially for starting a startup, how do you kind of explore it and then see what's needed and then actually start it? I think that's like the thing I'm scared about the most. Like, do you need a lot of funds to start it? Do you just need a good group of people? Could you kind of talk a little bit about how you got into being a co-founder for a startup?
Yeah. I'll wait for the microphone to travel back.
How much exercise I get?
So much exercise, so nice. So I'll say my experience just coming out of undergrad and starting a company was a little bit unique. But I feel like a common thread to keep in mind is just networking is so important and building the connections to answer some of those questions. You know, who should be in my team? What's the right approach to doing this? And finding experts who are specifically able to cover the areas that you don't know about. So for me, I actually connected with somebody who was interested in starting this company, but they wanted a team to help actually found the company and had relevant expertise. At the time, you know, I had some engineering experience, I had some EEG experience, and we wanted to build a EEG-based neurofeedback company. So I was leading the scientific development there as a CSO. But we also had a CEO who could answer, you know, funding related questions, the more business-oriented questions. And there was somebody who had the idea of translating this technology from fMRI to EEG. And then ultimately we hired a CTO as well. So I'll say you don't have to have all the expertise, but yes, like you were saying, you need to find that team. But I'll say, you know, my experience here and in some other areas as well has been more like, if you are able to network a lot, some of those opportunities and some of those people you'll kind of find each other if you're in the same sort of spaces. And I think that's true kind of throughout your career in both academia and in industry. So I'm sorry I can't speak as much to the process of, you know, building everything from the ground up, because I was lucky that I ran into people who were interested in this sort of thing and got pulled into that. But I do think a common thread is networking to find those resources and those people. Happy to talk more later. Yeah, they're entrepreneurship.
Okay. Another question? Yeah.
I have a question just kind of for everybody, but if you were to go back to do your PhD again, what would you do differently and why?
Who wants to start?
I wouldn't even
can do
qualify,
it. Okay, I guess so as the industry representative, I would say that I wish I'd done an internship in the early years of my PhD, just to know what it was about. I think most of the faculty I worked with, they had never had industry jobs. And so it was kind of like this big unknown, and it was kind of talked about like, oh, this person went to industry. Like they sold their soul, I don't know, something dramatic like that, but it's not true. And I wish I had just gone and seen how, you know, other organizations function. And I think you can actually learn a lot from industry in terms of like organizing yourself, organizing your thoughts. And then also this concept of pre-registration, I realize now is like what we do a lot in industry, which is we make a plan. And then we make a plan, we write it out, and we send it around to other stakeholders, that's the official term. And then they give feedback on it. So it's like pretty much pre-registration. Then, okay, this is the plan. And then we say, okay, we're gonna do it now. It's gonna be our sprint for 2 weeks. We're gonna like focus on this and do it. And I think that type of planning and focusing, these are skills that are useful regardless of where you're working. So yeah, internship.
It's a great question because for me, I think I ended up in sort of a perfect lab for what I wanted to do. So I was in something called an interdepartmental neuroscience program at Yale, which sort of spans a lot of different departments. So my PhD advisor and actually my postdoc advisor were both in biomedical engineering. And I was surrounded by a lot of different people. But I was still gaining both the neuroscience experience and sort of biomedical engineering relevant experience. So I felt like that was a really good department for me. But if I could, you know, take some of the skills I have now and go back, I think I personally would be interested in going into more statistics relevant department myself. A lot of my work is more statistics related, coming kind of from the engineering background and blending through data science into statistical needs and trying to understand the theory myself. So that's what I would think. I think pragmatically speaking, if I were interested in keeping all of my options open, a more sort of engineering, like formal engineering training would also have been very helpful, because you do get, at least in some of the programs that I was part of, you get the opportunity to do internships with different companies, which is not something that you always get the opportunity to do in, say, neuroscience or psychology. Sometimes statistics as well, but not always. I think engineering, you tend to see a lot more of that.
That is such an interesting question. And my first thought was like, if I went back, I feel like what's hard is like when you're in the middle of your PhD, it's like the science is in one spot, right? And by the time you get done, the science is going to be somewhere else. So there's only so many educated decisions you can make, right? It's like, where's the field? What are the opportunities available to me where there's enough expertise around for where the science is now to like, to build up what I can, knowledge wise. So I feel like in my case, and I think this is such a cool panel because it's like so interdisciplinary, and my interests are very interdisciplinary, but I always had a really strong clinical focus. And I actually really struggled with, should I just do in the beginning a neuroscience PhD or a clinical PhD? And genetics at the time when I was applying for grad school, really human genetics really wasn't where it is now. So that didn't occur to me. I, even in the middle of my clinical PhD, debated and had a conversation with somebody that was like doing induced pluripotent stem cell models. So like things where like you're really trying to work on in-depth model systems, like maybe I should just exit my clinical PhD and just switch and do a neuroscience PhD. I literally had a very real conversation with a faculty member about that. I obviously didn't make that choice. I don't regret not making that choice. For me, having the clinical expertise has opened so many doors, gave me so much experience in terms of working with clinical populations that I do love, and that was a good fit for me. But it meant that I have had to work quite hard to get the complementary training in other areas. And again, I feel like I basically took them as they came. And so basically, all I would say is a lot of the work everybody here is probably interested in is quite interdisciplinary, I think inherently. So I would say, keep in mind the things that you're really excited about and the opportunities that come up. And, I would say as much as it's within your ability to run towards the things, if you get really excited about something and there's an opportunity, like go for it. If you can learn something new, take a new class, do, workshops like this, make those connections for people doing work in fields that you're interested in, go for it. I think, what do I wish I could have done more of? I wish I'd done more programming at the time. That was, I think, the furthest thing. Like, I wasn't thinking about it because I came from so much more of an applied perspective. And I think, the programming expertise with where data science is going and the scale of the data sets we're all working with now, like it's just going to translate across the board. So I think getting strong skill set there, no matter what, is going to help you. And I think we can only do so much in science with wherever the science is at the time when you're in training. That's true.
Yeah.
I guess, for Jennifer, kind of expanding on what you had just said, kind of when you were in your clinical program, how did you balance kind of getting a strong foundation in like basic science and with all of the clinical like obligations, and how you want to like integrate that and translate it, and how would you say that continues in your work today?
Yeah, that was a hard balance. I did, I hope that there are more programs out there, like for those in clinical programs where, there's lots of exposure to people that are doing neuroscience coursework, or you've got neuroscience PhDs in the same lab that you're in. So like I did pick a lab where there were clinical PhD students, there were also neuroscience PhD students, and I knew at the program I was going to that there would be neuroscience classes that I could take. So my program in particular, UCLA, their clinical psych program, they have like an embedded minor, which is really interesting at the PhD level. So even though I didn't know anybody in the clinical program who had done this, I was like, I want a neuroscience minor, which means I'm going to take the classes in the neuroscience program to build that up for myself, because I know that that's what my interests are. But again, that's not what everybody's would be. So I think it's just sort of when you've got electives, going for it, even if it's kind of hard. I mean, yeah, did I work a lot of hours? Do I work a lot of hours? Yes. To get that, that's a personal choice, like lifestyle choice, right? So I did make that choice of I'm just gonna take those courses as they're available to me. And sometimes I might be putting in extra hours. And I think yeah, it's also about like what labs you pick, right, for your PhD or for your postdoc. So you can't learn everything during one stage of training, right? So I think it's also thinking about, is there something that I can't fill in right now? Or if there's like a T32 or a designated training program available to me, go for it if you can squeeze it in. And if the research is important to you, it means also prioritizing your time that way. So like not adding on tons of time doing extra clinical work if you don't absolutely have to. It's yeah, thinking about like, what do you care the most about and trying to fit it in. At least.
Okay.
I will convey questions from Slack. So I'll take this according to the order. So this is for the faculty folks here. This is Stephanie and Jen. How did you know the time was right to apply for it, to go for those faculty positions? Right? There's, I think, in our careers, the typical neuroscience research career. There's sort of this weird limbo or postdoc where you're not exactly sure. Oh, is now the time? So how did you know the time?
You never know.
Until you try.
Until you try, yeah. I get the microphone because I just started talking. That's very me. Yeah, I just want to echo kind of what I said is, I think many people feel like, oh, I'm not ready. It doesn't make sense. One piece of advice I'd gotten from a friend who was very wise, is to sort of look on paper at what you've accomplished. You've published some papers, you've mentored students. Those are big parts of your job. Maybe you've gotten some funding. You can start to see on paper that you have a record, even if you don't feel it, even if you're like, oh, I'm not ready for faculty, I'm not ready to be a professor. You can start to see that you've done things that are consistent with what a professor might do, leading up to their first year. So you can start to convince yourself, if you don't fully believe it already, that you do have the accomplishments on paper, you're already doing the things. I think that's really important. I think it can also be helpful to sort of maybe look at the CVs of people who've recently gotten faculty positions, see what sort of publications they've had, see, whether they had funding or not. You don't always need funding to get into your first faculty position. Something I think is incredibly important that I was definitely convincing myself to say at least sometime in this panel is, I found it really helpful to join something called the Future PI Slack. And I'd recommend any single person here who's interested in possibly going into academia to going into a faculty position to join this. People talk about all these questions about application, and they'll share a lot of information about the stats, where they've heard back from. Anonymously, often there's a spreadsheet that talks about all these things. You might see like who got offers, and you can also see CVs, but I think you don't just, it's also important not to compare yourself too much on paper with other people. You never know exactly what different committees are looking for. So I'll say, even if you don't, again, feel that you're 100% ready, but you see that on paper, you seem to be doing things that are consistent with new faculty members. It doesn't hurt to start looking at the job listings and see what's really exciting to you. And maybe start preparing, if you find one place or two places, two positions that seem really cool, you're so excited about it. Maybe it's a dream. Maybe you feel like everyone who's gotten in there have like 5 Nature publications and like a K99 and has had grants for the past 10 years. Still, you can start putting your job application together and you can just pour that motivation into the one place. And I think it's a very iterative process, like people who've written grants might also have experienced. Just that process of putting your ideas down, getting feedback. And then if you get the grant, you're trying to follow on this path, and it's not always perfectly in line with what you said you do, but at least you have a plan and you can refine it later. I think that's for me, and for some of my colleagues, I think it's a really good strategy. Just start your application and then you have lots of time to refine. But at least you have kind of a starting place. So lots of little pieces of advice.
Yeah, so many great nuggets of wisdom. That's a really cool point about the, that Slack channel. Yeah, I did not do that at the time. And maybe it wasn't around at the time when I was applying. I will say that for me, the K-99, I was, in a psychiatry department for my postdoc. And when you're in the medical school, I think a very natural path that a lot of people will, go through is to apply for like a K-08 or a K-23, the K-99, some kind of career development, award at that stage as a postdoc. And that is kind of tied to, you have to get institutional commitment that they won't give you a faculty position, which kind of prompts those conversations. So for me, that's sort of how it happened. It was like, okay, I'm having ideas of things I want to do. I know that this is a track, is to like apply for a career development award. And as I was doing that, it was like, okay, well then I'm, you know, at the same time, I'm going to be looking into, can I get a faculty position at this institution? Are they willing to support me? And that was really how it happened for me. It's not that and that's also a personal style, like where it was like, I was actually pretty happy being a postdoc. I was pretty happy, like I was in a wonderful lab, great environment, very supportive, with a PI at the time who was really supportive of me just like pursuing independent ideas too. So it helped. I didn't feel like the pressure of, oh, I need to go get a faculty job so I can have an independent lab. But that, I think for a lot of people also can be part of it. If your postdoc lab doesn't feel like you can pursue the ideas that you're most excited about, then that might also be a prompt. But another one is just, you're going to eventually as a postdoc have to get funded in some way or another, right? So a K of some sort will help you get that. And it usually does mean you're gonna transition to faculty one way or another.
Okay, I see a couple, so.
Hey, currently on a journey to find work-life balance, and I looked at your technology, just your journey through it, and if there are any like pivotal moments where there was a decision that you had to make that helped you work towards that, and you know, very thoughts you had about that. So first.
That's a great question. My previous role was in, we used to work with what's called community violence intervention organizations, where they take people who are from the community and formerly affiliated with a lot of the folks who are in danger of being, shooters or being shot in a lot of these neighborhoods, and get them to provide alternate pathways. So the balance in terms of time there was taxed because nobody works regular hours. You usually work around 2 to 10 or 2 to midnight, if you're at the street level. But something I learned there was that you can't place your own mental health as a second-class citizen, under the guise of saying, oh, these people have it much worse than me, these people have it much worse than me. If you continue to put that off, at some point you realize you're no use to them as a research partner or a collaborator if you're not taking care of yourself. So I had that a couple, maybe 5-6 months into that role. And in my present role, I think my boss sets an incredible standard for saying, just frankly letting you know, hey, it's not that deep sometimes. You know, you could close the laptop and you could put your phone away. I went to a wedding where I was trying to work remotely. She said, whatever you're slacking me about right now, you're not going to remember. You're in the wedding party of one of your good friends. You should remember that. And if you give someone an inch and you don't trust them, they'll take a mile because they have an incentive to take work from you. And I appreciate that I have people who set that standard for me.
Yeah, I love this question because when I first started, you know, in my PhD, people kept telling me it's a marathon, not a sprint, but I was like sprinting, you know, because like, yeah, I mean, why not? There's so many, I'm so curious. I was in a new field, like, what is this? I had so many questions and I get kind of obsessed, you know? But it wasn't good for my body because I would like hunch over the computer. And then before you know it, like I'm just in so much pain. So anyway, PhD, maybe not the best work-life balance. For my postdoc with that guy, great. You know, like I was just like, no, things are gonna change, you know, I'm gonna enjoy Seattle. You know, I just got married. And so, you know, it was a conscious choice to like force myself to shut that laptop at 5. Now I have 2 kids. I feel like I should have mentioned that earlier because that's actually really relevant because they're like way harder than anything I've ever done. Like PhD, post, like whatever. Kids are crazy hard. I have 2 of them, 1 and 3. And now I don't really have a choice. Like I have to like feed them and put them to bed. And so it can be hard at times because now I'm in a new field again. I feel like I'm back in my PhD. I don't know anything and I'm so curious. I have 1,000 questions about proteins. But I can't answer them, you know, like I have to stop at 5 and sometimes it can be really hard. So yeah, now I don't know, it's always kind of a bit of a struggle, but having these like set boundaries and like holding yourself to them is really important for your health, mental and physical.
I completely agree. You have to be very intentional about setting your boundaries. I'll say for me to answer this question, I actually feel like I have a secret weapon, which is that I'm married to a clinical psychologist who specializes in anxiety and mood disorders. And he's also an incredibly brilliant researcher, Joshua Curtis, and he does like amazing statistics and machine learning stuff. So he also gets the science side. But he is very, very intentional about creating work-life balance. And I think that that's really bled into the way I approach science as well. And I think that this actually kind of echoes stuff that you both were talking about, which is when you have other people around you that internalize this and make work-life balance a priority, it's so much easier for you to also do that. If you're surrounded by people who are like, you know, working on grants every single day, 365 days a year, up until 3 a.m. every single day. And they say, you know, if you're not doing that, what are you really doing with your life? It's really much harder to set those boundaries. Yeah, I would say that it was a bit challenging for me during the PhD. But then I'm personally kind of a slow scientist and I'm also a slow reader. But I found that when I have moments where I've created space for myself and let's say doing something that might even bore me a bit and giving myself space to get bored and space to not be thinking very intensely about something, I actually find myself often being a little bit more creative or going into, just because I'm really excited and motivated, going into researching different avenues that are really cool to me and playing around with ideas rather than feeling like stressed about those ideas, being really inspired and excited about those ideas. And I think that that's something for me personally and for some other colleagues, it seems very important to keep that throughout your career. If you just have this tension and the stress driving you throughout your whole career, you're going to feel burnt out, you're going to feel unhappy. But if you keep this sort of like a curiosity and inspiration and motivation that's really uplifting, it just makes your work so much more fun. And then none of our work is really like, you might have a grant deadline. Yes, you have to work towards that. But often our work is not, you know, there are so many times where I say, okay, I definitely have to have this done, you know, in 2 weeks. And then 2 weeks will go by and I'm still working on it. And then we realize we have some other things we have to do, some other things. And then maybe several months later, we've solved some of these different problems. And you realize that short deadline, that was just unrealistic. It didn't make sense. Science progresses very slowly and there's so much that you can't anticipate. If I had said, you know, I need to do this in 2 weeks, I'm going to a wedding, I'm just gonna like work through this wedding. And then months later, it was, you know, I realized that deadline was arbitrary. I would have been so sad, you know, I would have missed the wedding, I would have missed all these things. So just sort of being patient with yourself, recognizing that science is often quite slow. And, you know, you might have really great ideas when you're patient with yourself, when you give yourself time. It works differently for everybody, but that's how it works best for me.
I would say, you know, work-life balance is something that I'm still working on. I think it's always going to be a work in progress, probably for all of us, but I also think as a clinical psychologist, I also think about the things that like improve our mood, right? And it's things that give you joy and things that give you mastery are a big part of it, right? And for me, science actually gives me a lot of both of those, like to get lost in new papers and research. It's like really interesting, that curiosity. And if I'm learning a new method or learning a new field and getting to the other side of learning it, I get a lot of mastery from that. So because of that, I think one part of academia, you know, there are lots of things about my current job and my current role where I get these things that, you know, I really enjoy, right? So like work doesn't always feel like just straight work. So I'll say that first. In that, like, so that doesn't mean that I think, oh, I have to have a hard 40-hour work week and stop. I don't really think about it that way. I think about for myself, what are the things that help me be balanced and be in a good place in general. So my work actually is part of it. That's not going to be the case for everybody, but for me, I really enjoy a lot of my work. You know, relationships with friends, with my partner, with family are also really important for me. I notice like if I've gone too long without, catching up with friends, like my mood does start to drop. Or if I haven't gone outside, gone for a hike or like done some kind of exercise, like in, few days and like a couple weeks or something like that, like my mood will drop. So I've sort of tried to figure out what are the things that I need to stay in a good place. And then I don't think so hard and fast about what are my work hours around it, but just sort of making sure I'm on a regular basis, kind of fitting in all of those things. And in times where like I do feel, usually more self-motivated, like internally, like I feel pressure to get certain things done. But I notice I'm starting to feel burnt out or stressed, like going back to the thought of, hey, like, what is this deadline? Like, is it okay if like somebody gets that done first? Like a lot of science is slow, like that's okay. I also need to like be in an okay place in the long run, not just like these next, 3 months.
I want to add something because I think you brought up a really great point, Jennifer, which is a lot of us take a lot of joy in our work. And there are some parts of our work that bring us a lot of joy. And then there are other parts that are just, requirements and part of the job that are not so exciting. Responding to 1 million emails a day, not so joyful. Thinking through, statistical problems with your trainees, pretty fun. But I think it's helpful to also think about prioritizing those things, like the things that bring you joy, that are scientific, and then the things that really aren't as important, and really not spend as much time on those things and just get them done. And not, you could spend, weeks long preparing a talk, or you could, get it done and you'll do a great job. But you really need to think about like how much time you're spending on the things that are really, really important and bring you joy.
Hi, I think this question could be for any of you, but as you were deciding on your next step in your career, whether it's deciding to pursue a faculty job or to try a job in industry, are there any factors that you consider or things that you reflected on about yourself that helped you just make that decision where you thought, this is something about me that I think is going to help me thrive in this next career? So that kind of thing.
I can try, yeah.
You?
I don't think introspection is easy and it didn't come naturally to me for a long time. So I'll qualify my answer by saying that, but in the first couple interviews, if you can do as good of a job as you can to understand what the role is actually going to be like, rather than like a shiny posting on Handshake, that's really helpful. And that most often is going to have to do with the person interviewing you. They can only tell you so many things about the role that have material effect on your experience. But if you ask them what it's like and you get a sense for who they are, it's a lot more about the personality match. People leave their jobs because they're underpaid and because they hate their manager. You have a chance to talk to them before they ever bill you for anything or you ever bill them for anything. So I would take advantage of that. And specifically something about me, I can't be at my desk all day and I will lose, I'll lose traction, I'll lose speed. And in my previous role, I loved spending a lot of my time in the field and talking to people. And I asked for some assurance of that prior to beginning this new role. And my manager understood that, so.
Well, yeah, so to just rephrase, right, you're basically asking like, when is the time to make a move? Like, when is the time to change? How do you know when that's right? So for me, made a few changes. I think more recently, I'd been at my previous job, which was like the PhD job, we'll call it that, right? Because I was like basically doing my PhD. I'd been there for a while. I had 2 babies during this whole thing, right? So I couldn't move because I just didn't feel like interviewing while super pregnant. I know they can't discriminate, but like, let's be real. So I couldn't move. But one thing I realized, after, now my second kid is older, is that I didn't feel like an imposter anymore, right? Like I'd been doing neuroimaging for a while. I was in a company. We weren't really doing research. We're doing more so like productionizing things. And I was very comfortable. And then I realized about myself is like, I actually really like learning. I love obsessing over things and like having to cut off at 5 because otherwise I could just like work all night, right? I missed that. And so I realized like I need to be uncomfortable again. I need to feel like I don't know anything anymore, and that's where I am right now, and it's great. So I highly recommend it.
That's great. Yeah, I think, also thinking about the element of, you know, how do you determine whether your personality type is the right fit for a job type? I think this is it's quite difficult, and it's something where you do have to do sort of intel gathering. And that's kind of going back to my point about networking being really important across, you know, industry and academia and government, wherever else you'd like to be, just to be able to talk to people who are in those roles and see what their life is like, and if you can imagine yourself living that sort of life. I do want to say I keep seeing there's always like a grass is always greener kind of vibe that you'll see people talking about, you know, in person or on social media, particularly when we're thinking about, you know, academia to industry, because a lot of academics don't know what industry is like. And there are many, many different types of industry positions. And there are some that are really great. There are some that are very much like academia as well. There are some where you will definitely have a better work-life balance than maybe your particular lab. There are some positions, I have some friends who went to some big consulting companies and then very quickly left those companies that are quite painful. And there are so many different types of consulting. I've been involved in a couple different consulting companies and I've loved it, kind of smaller companies, and I'm currently involved in one. It's a lovely sort of situation, and it's as an academic doing this part-time. But I've heard of really also bad things, but I think there's like a tendency to romanticize and paint, you know, all industry positions with this one brush. But that's where, you know, doing the intel gathering and seeing what things are like. And I think it's just helpful to think like, if I had that person's job, would I enjoy that? Because it's hard to do, like, to predict the future perfectly, but just getting a little bit more information, I think, is helpful.
I don't really have too much to add on top of that, except, yeah, I totally agree that I think with whatever the different position options are that are available to you, as best you can, getting a sense of like, what does that person's actual like day-to-day look like? Like, what do they like or maybe not like, right? Every role that we have, there's gonna be parts we like, parts that we don't like as much. And just thinking for yourself, like, okay, like what kinds of parts of my current role do I really enjoy? And how much do I want to be in a space where I maybe am learning something brand new, or do I like to be able to do things where more of it is familiar, and just sort of thinking about it, chatting with people, and like, yeah, just introspecting on yourself, where you're at and what you want your day-to-day to look like for the next, you know, few years.
Yeah, okay, we'll do this in English.
Yeah, I'll try to consolidate actually a couple of questions here from Slack that to Anisha related to like the transition to industry. How did you go about this process? How did you know whether you had sort of the skills needed? What was sort of the thought process? And then actually the process technically, like how did you start figuring out where to go, how to apply and things like that? So what was the transition?
Sure. Okay. Okay, story time. Okay, so my first, you know, entry into industry kind of doesn't count, because I was at the right place at the right time. The founders of that company were doing their research. So, like you were mentioning earlier, you know, people who start companies do a lot of background research before they start. They try to network and know everybody. And so I happened to be in a lab, which was, you know, the department was run by Steve Hauser, who's like a big name in MS. And so, of course, people starting a company around multiple sclerosis were going to talk to him, and he happened to see something I did, right? And I do a lot of data visualization. So he was like, oh, this is what should exist in MS care. And so they started talking to me. And at first I was like, oh, I'm going to stay in academia because that's, you know, the only thing I know. And then eventually they kept like talking to me, and like kept emailing me every now and then, like, hey, just wanted to check in. How are you doing? So eventually I just like walked in. So this doesn't really count. But recently, you know, the company that I was in, they did layoffs, and this pissed me off because these were my friends, right? And so it was so hard to go from this like group of people that I worked with for like 4 years, and then like 30% of them are gone. And so, yes, I was still there. I still had my job, but I was like, I don't like this. And it's the reality of the economy when you're in industry, is like, you could get laid off. You could be really good at your job and you could still get laid off because, you know, there are other market forces, and I don't really know the businessy stuff, but you have to be prepared for that. And so while I wasn't laid off, I was like, you know what, one fear I have is that I just haven't actually applied for jobs. Like, how do you even start this? I don't even know what I'm doing. So, so my friend and I, we both, okay, this is kind of a funny story. So this is a science experiment. So two people got their PhDs at the same time, were in the same lab, worked at the same job with the same job title. So like, we were equally qualified for things. And so we started a little competition because we were both unhappy with our jobs, and we made a little leaderboard because I have to gamify everything. And so the leaderboard was like, how many job application rejections can you get? Right. So this is, I think, and so I went with the like large N approach, where I just kind of like went on LinkedIn. I paid $40 for that premium, and I went hard. If they asked for a cover letter, if it was required, then ChatGPT wrote it. If it was not required, then I didn't submit it. And because I don't know, so I did this, right? So I went hard, and I think I was at like 40 applications. It was a lot to keep track of. Meanwhile, my friend, she like, Keshi, puts her heart and soul into that cover letter, which probably nobody reads, right? And for every LinkedIn like posting, she would like carefully read the description and like picture herself there. Could I actually work at this company? Rather, I was just like, just whatever, sure, whatever. You know, I just want the experience of interviewing. I was so scared of the technical interview. So, so one person was very thoughtful, poured her heart and soul into it, and then I was not. But I did apply to a lot more jobs, right? And so Keshi actually got extra points when she got a rejection because like she poured her heart and soul into it. And so the rejection was much harder. So I would say we actually tied in terms of you know, the leaderboard. We both got jobs, same salary, same start date, everything was the same. So two wildly different approaches from like essentially the same person, same result. No result, yeah. So yeah, so that was my biggest fear was like, I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm gonna get these technical interviews and I'm not gonna have any idea with these like weird random programming questions that I don't use on a day-to-day basis. So first of all, of the 40, let's say 40, I would say maybe like 5 recruiters actually called me back, just like desk rejection immediately. And it could have been a computer rejection, right? Maybe I didn't have the right keywords in my CV or something like that. So there's definitely like, I maybe could have optimized my CV a little more to get past the like computer stage. Then the recruiter calls you and they're like, oh, would you be like willing to relocate to San Francisco? And I was like, no, I have kids, family, I live close to my parents, free childcare, big deal. So then, you know, you get rejections from like the recruiters because it's just like not a good fit for your family. Fine. So then I would say I had like 4 active interviews. And of course, all of these came in at the same time while I had a full-time job. And I would go from like Zoom interview to like work Zoom call to like a different company Zoom interview. And I would totally confuse things because I'm also sleep deprived. Somehow made it through. And so at the end of the day, 4 like I would say active interviews and then 3 offers. So that was like a pretty good 75%. Like once I got talking to people, it was good, but it's hard to get past that first stage of just like talking to a human being. So I would recommend between the 2 strategies, you know, the heart and soul strategy versus like, I don't know what we want to call mine.
Large N, yes.
That, you know, I recommend it because I didn't care when I got, I mean, after a while, there were some days where you get like 5 email rejections in a row. That sucked, but it's okay. So that's one thing is like the large N strategy does work because one of my offers was just I just blindly applied. I didn't know anybody, but the point about networking is actually really important. And you guys should all be networking here because like some of you are going to go in an industry job and remember one of the people you met at Neurohack Academy and be like, oh yeah, that person was pretty smart. Like we have a job opening. Maybe we should reach out to that person. So my current job that I have at Big Hat was Keshi told somebody who was a recruiter at some VC about me, and she emailed me and I was like, oh, hey, I'm looking for a job. And I thought she was a bot because when you get on LinkedIn, a lot of people will be like, oh, I'm a recruiter for blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, are you really a recruiter? I don't know. Anyway, this person was real. So I did get my job through a connection, and my other offer was also through a connection. And then one that was like no connection. So it's statistics that 1/3. Really, I don't know. Whatever. The point is you can do it with a large N, but it's much easier if you network and you just keep trying and trying and trying. So I actually have a follow-up question for the faculty thing about like, when is the right time to apply? Does it hurt to just like apply like every year until you finally get it?
So, yeah, that's a great question. Networking, first off, like
Yeah.
so critical, so underrated for both academia and industry. I've had, the consulting and the startup experience that I mentioned, that was all, networking based, finding people who I knew or who knew of me. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of people I've heard of who ended up in industry as well have had similar stories, people finding them or just hearing of them. And in academia, it's so important too. But to answer your question, I feel like a really good strategy is you should definitely plan to be on the job market in academia for a faculty position for at least a couple years. That's sort of the reality of the job now. If you go to the Future PI Slack, there's statistics on this, but people will be applying for 100 positions in a year and maybe hear back, get like
So they went like
like
this
first, it's a lot, yeah, no,
Yeah.
there are a lot of large N.
Yeah, large
Um,
N.
yeah. Not everyone is, I'd say like a lot of people who are sort of the first year on the job market, from what I remember from the Future PI Slack, maybe they're applying to something like 20 to 40 positions, I think. That sounds about right. I kind of went the strategy of, for my first year that I was planning to be on the market, I applied to just a few that were like right up in the data science, but anyways, that's, I
your
can go
heart and
into a
soul
whole bit.
strategy.
Yeah, heart and soul
Got
strategy.
it, okay.
With the expectation that I wouldn't get a position and that I'd apply more broadly the next year. But I'd say a lot of people are kind of doing this sort of apply before you think you're 100% ready, just to have, the experience, if at all
Get over the
possible.
fear of like,
Yeah,
doing it,
getting over
yeah.
the fear of doing it, I think is really big. And like just starting the ball rolling on even thinking about what is my research program? What do I want to do for the next, lifetime of faculty work, or at least the next 5 years? And getting feedback on that. If you get a first level interview, then you have also experience talking to, other faculty at the program that you might be interested in. You just you understand a little bit more of the process and what people might be looking for. You can also start to appreciate how much randomness there is in what people might be looking for. So some people also apply a bit more broadly because a faculty a listing for a position might say that they're interested in something, but they don't always have enough time to fully update that listing based on, the most up-to-date understanding of what everyone in the department is actually looking for. Or there might be a conversation after you've already applied and they might sort of rethink everybody's applications and get really excited about one or the other. But I think this idea of just sort of like starting the application a little bit earlier and getting your feet wet and starting to prepare all the materials and getting experience, that's one that people are starting to embrace a lot more. But yeah, again, back to sort of the earlier answer, most people that I've spoken with don't feel like they're ready when they go into the job market, but there's more and more of a push that you tend to be ready before you think you're ready. So you might as well, if you get excited about something, go ahead and apply.
Cool, thanks for answering.
Yeah, of course. Sorry.
Okay, I don't have that much to add on to that, but I will say I also am the heart and soul kind of approach too. So I'm not very good. And I also struggled with like, I don't really feel ready. I did only apply to a handful of positions. Again, I actually was in a psychiatry department, and with a K in a psychiatry department, again, that's often tied to some kind of faculty position. So I'd already transitioned where I was to faculty, and then only because I saw really fantastic potential matches elsewhere and sort of like the politics you have to do when you're in a soft money position, did I consider applying elsewhere? And that happened to work, and it did make sense to move. Department here is great. Yeah, even though, yeah, I miss my old institution also, but I do think that, the process of applying, putting together those materials, and if you get interviews, the process of putting together a job talk, kind of like writing is thinking
Yeah.
while you're doing that application, writing is thinking while you're creating your job talk and really organizing your program of research. So even if I didn't really feel ready to like put together materials at the time that I did, clearly, like I had a good hit rate at that point in time. Like I was second guessing myself that, oh, I'm not going to be ready. Like it went pretty well. So I think, and part of that is because of that time of like, oh, I'm really going to pull together these materials. And actually that's helping me really figure out what's my story that I'm going to be pitching to these departments. So that strategy worked for me, but I totally support those that just like do it widely. And I think that can also be very effective. I think you know your own work style.
So my question goes back to the work-life balance, I guess, but on a longer scale. So what I wonder your experience is with like taking time off work and have your on your whether, and I ask this not with perspective of, oh, I don't want to do my job, I'd rather do something else, but like we can think of there are things that just don't fit all that well, but also working at the same time. Whether that be like extended travel trip or parenthood, or you know, being in an academia career phase where you may want to stay in academia, but you like for your industry and the way you live out in time to come back to academia, so like you're not actually not waiting, but I guess you're kind of leaving this one sphere for a while. Yeah, I'm wondering what in your experience or maybe you were like looking circle, the benefits and potential harms of that are like big a deal this would be, or maybe it would matter. Yeah, thinking about question is that for all of you.
My break was necessitated by a layoff. So that's, and it was the kind where you log on to a Zoom call that you think is one thing, and it's entirely another. So, to that end, I didn't do it by choice, but I loved it. And it's the best thing that ever happened to me. Because I think there's a bit of a heart and soul aspect to it where when you're applying, there's this weird, like almost blood-brain barrier where you're approaching it and you say, man, if they hire me, I'm gonna put everything into it. And so when I write my cover letter, I've got to really show them that I'm good for it. They'll drop you without knowing that you're good for it. The computer will drop you without knowing that you're good for it. So it's okay to have that healthy balance. And then once they actually give you a role, you can then once again vet them to make sure that they're good for it. And then you can give them your heart and soul. One thing that's nice about being early in your career is that nobody's looking to you as someone who's going to feed mouths, right? You have to feed yourself. And when I got laid off, that was a great relief to know that, okay, somebody has functionally told me they're going to drop me. So now I worked at a Jamaican restaurant for 2-3 months, front of house, serving chicken, things like that, while I applied for jobs. And it was great. I took a road trip with my partner and I enjoyed that. And spending time with yourself in a less than ideal situation will tell you so much more about what's going to come next than a false sense of allegiance to somebody who could, you know, tell you to click on a link and then drop you.
Yeah, so I've taken some breaks for maternity leave reasons, but so for the first kid, I was really dumb. I only took 7 weeks because that's how long like they would pay me or what, right? Because I didn't want to go unpaid because when you're a grad student, right? It's like you need the money, right? And so I was kind of still in that mindset of like, okay, like must work, you know, and like I'll figure it out. And it's so stupid because like it's stupid for both the company and for you because the company is paying someone who's like so sleep deprived, right? Like they don't know anything. I just sat there, you know, like why am I here? And I'm missing out on time that I'm never going to get back, you know, with my cute baby who also yells at me a lot. So I learned my lesson the second time around, you know, with an industry salary, like I could have taken some time off. What's wrong with me? Anyway, so for the second kid, you know, I already had one kid that was, you know, 2 years old. And so now, you know, I think I took 5 months off. Yeah, because California protects you. Anyway, so I was protected 5 months. It was the best time of my life. I mean, I got to hang out with my toddler. I had a newborn and I actually knew what I was doing the second time around. So it wasn't like as anxiety inducing. It was a great time. And then I will say from the hiring front. So when I was at my previous job, we were hiring people and it was during a time of layoffs, right? And I never read any cover letters. Yeah. And then, so that's why I never wrote them because I never read them. There's so many applicants. Okay. So then, I would be interviewing people and I remember I had this great interview with this guy and he was telling me about his research doing like cool immunology, like T cell, you know, like doing stuff to the T cell to kill all the other baddies in the immune system or whatever. And I was like, that is such a cool role. Why in the world do you want to come work here? I didn't say that unprofessionally, but I was basically like, why do you want to adopt him? He's like, I've been laid off for 6 months. And I was like, oh, I didn't even look at your resume. Right? Because the point is he knew his stuff. And yeah, he hadn't worked for 6 months. I didn't care that he got, I mean, I didn't look, but like, I wouldn't have cared, right? And it didn't matter. And the person we ended up hiring, yeah, he hadn't been working for like 4 months or something like that. He's great. It's fine to take a break, do what you gotta do for yourself. It's not so cutthroat that if you don't work for like a week or a month or something that you won't get a job. It's not that crazy out there. You can take a break.
Yeah, and I like to think of it in terms of you're investing the time now into things that you think are really important to you. So if you know, for me, I try to make the time to work out several times a week. And if that happens to mean that we might be meeting a little bit later, sometimes my lab is quite flexible. But I'm like, okay, it's important for me to invest this time now to make sure that I'm happy and healthy and can keep sustaining the work that I need to do. So if you feel like, you're hitting a wall, you need some time, you're very stressed, you're having health issues, any sort of number of reasons that you feel like you might need a break, is it really going to change the course of your work to work through it for another week or so? If you even took a whole week, a couple weeks and did something else, would that really change the whole course of the scientific development or the scientific enterprise at large? Not really. I think there's so much, we put a lot more pressure on ourselves than, the reality actually dictates. I'll say for myself, I haven't taken formally some of these large breaks, but during COVID, we all kind of took a break of sorts, when we were all sort of rethinking what sort of work that we would do. I ended up exercising a bit more and painting a lot more. I would go on walks and I would paint, and like I do watercolors. I used to do oil painting, which is quite a switch. But I got very, very into that, and it was very, very helpful for me. And again, if I'm doing things like painting, people might, be very, they might go very heavy into exercise, or they might go into different sets of arts, they might meditate. But for me, doing something like that, where I'm sort of clearing my mind and working on painting for hours, it just like, it opens my mind, it helps me be more focused, it helps me be more relaxed, it helps me be all kinds of things, more fulfilled, feeling creative. And I do feel like when I make time like that for myself, exercise, painting, doing other things, reading, not being on my phone and just sort of scrolling blindly, I think that's the opposite effect. I feel like I am also a better scientist. That's the way I personally work. Everyone works differently. But for me, I sort of work in this sort of creative way where I can open like a space for myself to be creative scientifically as well. But when I travel for conferences, I try to make a point of also going and traveling, around the city, trying new food, going on hikes. And I feel like something like OHBM, when I started going to that, or SFN, you end up, you're like, okay, I'm gonna go to this session and this session and this session and this session back to back. And then I guess I will pass out 8 hours later on my bed and just do the whole same thing the next day. But I quickly realized that at the end of the day, the next day, I would think back, okay, what do I remember from the sessions yesterday? Oh, nothing, because I was just like dying, like sitting through these lectures, trying to take frantic notes. And I think that we all can like make the time to take a break, and you'll remember the things you go to the things that are important, and then you'll remember the things that are important better when you take some space and you get to relax and you get to see new places. Seattle is incredible. I love walking around Seattle. I love Pike Market. I love the Capitol Hill area. Amazing food, amazing coffee, but you completely miss all that if you're just like, not trying to take the space. I love that there's a break this weekend and there's plenty of time every day to go visit. But I think it's very important to like intentionally make those breaks for yourself, do other things, and open your mind up for, the things that are really important and some creative freedom.
Those are great points. Just in case, sort of this is part of the question and didn't get answered, I'm not sure if it was. I personally haven't taken like a long break anywhere in my academic career, so I can't speak to that personally, but I will say I've seen a lot of colleagues both during their PhDs. I've also seen colleagues now at the faculty level who take different versions of break or explore industry like for 6 months. So when I was a postdoc, somebody who was a postdoc in another lab, over the summer, she decided she wanted to do an industry internship. She went to Genentech for a while to give it a try, right? Like I think a lot of labs, not all of them, so it'll depend if you're in a lab right now and you're thinking about something like that, Will they be supportive? A lot of labs will be. I know like Ariel, you had a PhD student who did that like over the summer recently. To try out like a very different lab, learn some new methods, right? And see what they think. When I was a PhD student, somebody who was in the year above me in my program, he's now faculty, super successful faculty. He's awesome, but he took a year to just try out industry. Tried it out and decided, you know what, actually that doesn't feel great. And then he came back to the program and stayed in the program. I know a faculty member here who is, you know, some departments, so maybe just in case, I won't say what department she's in, but some departments where often there are some people that go to industry, or where it's increasingly common for people to straddle academia and industry. Some departments will let you for a time do part-time appointments. And again, it really will depend on the department, but I know somebody who is going to try that out, and their department has built-in flexibility for that scenario. So it partially depends on the setting you're in. I also know people who've taken, you know, a quarter, 2 quarters off because, you know, for medical leave, either physical, mental health, and that's okay. They came back and things went well. You know, they just paid attention to themselves, what their needs were, and went and, you know, did what they needed to do to take care of themselves. So I think don't be afraid of taking a break or trying something else out. It will depend on your specific situation, but don't be afraid if you feel like you need to do it.
Yeah, I just want to echo, that's a good point. This question specifically, if you're leaving academia and coming back, I've heard a couple people who've been able to successfully do that, who were in jobs that were neuroscience oriented, and then came back to kind of a neuroscience oriented faculty position. I think it's very possible, particularly for more engineering types of departments. But I think it's also important to see if you're continuing to hit those milestones that are important for faculty positions, because eventually, if you're post tenure, that's one thing. If you post tenure and left and came back, but let's say you're pre-tenure, you still have to make it to this position where people, you know of your work well enough that they would write tenure letters for you and say that your work is really great. So if you're in industry, you know, for instance, publishing or going to the conferences and continuing to stay in the academic network, I think if you do it in a certain way, I have heard of some success cases from academia to industry to back.
Okay, I'm trying to combine a couple of things here. This is more for, I guess, for the PIs and the panel. How do you sort of create the direction for the research? Where do the research ideas come from? How do you sort of think about new ideas and new directions that you kind
How did this out?
Go for it, yeah.
I wonder if you'll have a similar answer in the respect that part of it came out of the K-99 process. So I think one of the most helpful things for me has been working through NIH grant applications. So from the PhD to the postdoc, I had a F99 K00, which is diversity specialized. And then from the K99 to the R00, that's postdoc to faculty. But I felt that working through these NIH applications where you are supposed to chart your path over the next, let's say 5 odd years and into the future, really helped me sort of clarify and think very intentionally about what sorts of things I would do. And I think it's very important to note that for those of you who may not have seen NIH applications or applied for these things, if you say that you're going to do something, especially let's say at the PhD to postdoc level, and even to an extent at the faculty level, you do not have to do exactly what you said you're going to do. It's more like you're setting up a roadmap and you're convincing someone else that you could plausibly follow that roadmap. And you're making you're putting down some evidence like, look, I have this experience and it's possible that this thing that I'm saying could actually happen, but there's a lot of room for flexibility. You know, if you end up publishing something and making something useful out of it, all the better for you. I think that that's kind of the main end goal for a lot of these applications. But for me, that's where I really started thinking very carefully about what things were most exciting to me, what was sort of an overarching story, even if it's not the be all end all story that I end up committing to, what's like a starting place for me to think about what sort of research I'd be excited about. This has changed quite a bit for me, but I will say I kept coming back to the anchor of the story that I told, and it helped me kind of shape where I eventually go down. There are some things that are very kind of somewhat more linear for me, like some ideas of mine that I'm working on currently that follow somewhat logically out of the umbrella of, I'll say, like reliability and validity research that was kind of started in my PhD. Quite different because that's a very big umbrella, but it sort of follows in that general story. And then there's some things that are quite different that I've been really excited about, some more sort of some more philosophical directions, some other sort of like individual level modeling stuff that I've been working on for a while. And that's just like ideas that I've sort of picked up along the way. And that's something too, you have this story, but then as you're growing up as a scientist in academia, you start to observe more and more. Just the longer that you're in academia, when you're a PhD student, you have only 5 years to observe things in the field. But as you go farther and farther, you start to think, oh yeah, 7 years ago, 10 years ago, I remember somebody talking about this. And I remember this seems to be a really big problem. You have this longer history where you can pick up on gaps in the field and you can see like where certain things are heading a little bit more. And that's where other sorts of ideas will come up. So you might have something of a roadmap, but there's definitely new things that will come up, I think, as you just had a longer history in the field.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I do think like grant writing for like NIH or NSF, whatever, when you are forced to put those ideas down, that does give you a starting roadmap. A lot of the ideas also come as you start to like work on those projects, right? A lot of your hypotheses often don't work out, and instead you see interesting things in the data and you're like, that might send you down another rabbit hole. So that I think is sort of one part of where research ideas come from. Another big part for me personally, like I really, as I've been saying, I really like different fields that come at related questions or give you new tools to get at questions that excite you. And so I think I love Twitter for that. Like I have a pretty curated, long list of people I follow, but I love seeing like, what's coming out? And like, does that get me jazzed about any new methods or ideas that I want to think about? Conferences, I feel like can also be really nice for that. Sometimes, conferences can sometimes be overwhelming, but sometimes I'll be thinking about things that I've been seeing coming out in the literature or things I'm hearing about at conferences, and I'll just give myself some time to let them sort of roll around. If I'm starting to get some ideas, then I start jotting some of them down. Some of them are ones I end up working on, some of them are ones I don't, but I notice sometimes, do I keep on coming back to the same thoughts or same questions? Then you know what, maybe I actually should put in the effort and like try to put in a grant related to that. So that's my process.
I was hoping to get some advice on the best networking practices. I've been talking like unspoken rules of networking.
I would be really shameless as you can. I think it's very easy to like try and bring a sense of propriety to something as a job or someone you don't know, but this is gonna sound crap, but you're just trying to get paid. I mean, that's the bottom line, right? And you can, right? It's that simple. You go to somebody and bring your best self and say, hey, this is me. I'm on the hunt. And that their empathy is already there. Everybody has had to look for a job. And just by virtue of that, they're going to be empathetic to you. And they're going to commend the fact that you were courageous enough to reach out, that you took the time. And in fact, they might even commend the fact that they don't even know you that well if they're on the outer reaches of your network. But any sort of consternation around, oh, what will they think? You're putting your life story into this cover letter, into this resume. What about those people? They're already going to judge you, right? So being shameless is really the best. And just go up to as many people as you can and say, man, I knew your cousin, he was into this, just let me get it. And I think it's one thing that's nice about, I moved from Chicago to here, and I have people in Chicago hit me up, say, hey, I had interest in such and such. And that's really my most blessed asset in life, is the people that I've met in my work and outside of that. So if somebody comes and asks me that question, I never want to disincentivize by saying, I don't think you're actually worthy of me. No, that's terrible. That's terrible. You're just as shameless as you can and say, look, just help me out real quick. Yeah, I got you. It's so easy. How hard is it to make an introduction, right? It's like 300 words in a text message.
Yeah. Okay. So one rule I didn't know is that you should like email people back. Or like if someone gives you, no wait, okay, if someone gives you their business card, just be like, hey, it's nice meeting you. Like email them. Or I think the worst though is like, I didn't know that after job interviews, you're supposed to email them to thank them. and say something about, yeah, I didn't know that, so. Someone told me later, like, oh, did you send the thank you email? I'm like, what's the thank you email? There is a thank you email. Yeah,
I actually gave a talk about networking at OHBM, so I'm trying to remember the core points that I want to communicate here. One of them is, I'm about to talk about various different strategies you can use. Not all of them work for everybody, so it's fine to be like, I love going in person to conferences, to socials, but I hate social media so much, and I tried it and it's terrible. You don't have to be like, oh, all the best people say get on social media, I'm just gonna force myself. It's fine. I think it's kind of like there's a bunch of strategies and you should definitely try a lot of them and consistently do some of them. But don't force yourself into areas that are uncomfortable for you. So that said, a quick rundown off the top of my head is, so conferences, going to socials, for example, if there's a talk that you really like afterwards, feel free to go up to the speaker and just talk with them and say, I really liked your talk. And you can chat with them, or even, suggest, I'd love to grab coffee or something like that, So conferences, really great opportunities there. If you're at a poster session, you can talk with your fellow poster people. You are allowed to leave your poster. I know some people are like, I should be at my poster all day long. No, you can go and like talk with other people. If you're part of a panel with some other people, you could ask them, if they want to grab drinks afterwards or before, or lunch or coffee, anything really. And often people are really excited about that. Or beforehand, I've been part of symposia where people are like, yeah, let's get a pre-lunch. Let's do like a pre-symposium lunch, and then let's all like do drinks afterwards, because they were really excited in the moment. So conference opportunities, paper opportunities. If there's someone who you think could contribute something to your paper, someone who's really, has done a lot of work in the area, people tend to be very excited when you reach out and you say, I'd love to have your input. Would you be interested in collaborating? I think there's sometimes a fear, oh, this person is probably super busy, and I'm so lowly and unimportant, and why would they ever talk to me? People love hearing from young scientists and working with them. I'd say I'm also a young scientist. People like working with me. I like working with other people. I think, there's I'd say in academia, and specifically in the more kind of open sciencey space, like, I think my gut feeling is 90% of the academics here would be very excited to receive an email like that, or at least happy. Like, oh, that's great. Of course. Like, let's work together on this thing. So papers, grants, if you're applying for a grant, often, postdoc level grant or PhD level grant, you're required to find a mentorship team. That is an amazing opportunity to reach out to whatever stellar person in the field who maybe has a big network, and has done really cool stuff, and say, hey, your work is awesome, flattery. And then like, I'd love if you would be a part of my mentorship team. It doesn't need to be a big time commitment. And I would encourage you to add that, like, we can work around your schedule, blah, 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 make it a light lift. So the person feels very encouraged to say yes. But they're all but the NIH is all but expecting you to use this as an opportunity to grow your network. So, all right, so grants. There's also online social media has been incredibly useful for me. I've learned about critical papers. I've connected with really great scientists who I've ended up collaborating with. I've seen some job offers. I have engaged in really important conversations that led to important actual, let's say, symposia and papers from social media. And I've been able to keep my finger on the pulse of, let's say, the most important controversial issues and see how people actually think about them. I would encourage people in our field, people are very active on Twitter. There's also a community that's active on Blue Sky and Mastodon. I'd say it's a smaller portion of the community, but people who are really committed to open science really respect the fact that these communities have those principles. But I'd encourage you to at least try Twitter a bit. It can be very annoying at first, but you kind of get into a habit. You're worried about getting addicted to social media, you can set those timers, maybe check 5 minutes a couple times a week, is maybe a good place to start. And then online communities, I mentioned Future PI Slack, there are a bunch of, Brain Hack is awesome, the Open Science Special Interest Group, you could volunteer for some things like that or for Brain Hack and then be part of some of those online communities. You can volunteer to be part of the Open Science Special Interest Group or Brain Hack planning committees. So those are some groups that you could join in person or virtually to help with the organization, and you really grow your network in that way. Yeah, but then that's all I can remember off the top of my head, which is a quick overview of the talk. I'd say, again, just try some of it, see what works for you.
I'm not gonna add too much. I think that was pretty thorough. So yeah, like, I guess the question was rules. I would just say the only thing I would add is, yeah, keep in mind, if you're reaching out to PIs, maybe who are very senior and might be very busy, just be like, keep that in mind, right? Yes, flattery, like have read their, or have some idea of like why it is you're reaching out to them. They may or may not have time. That's okay. But reaching out is an awesome strategy, and just be gracious about it if you can, I think, because that is the only thing, is if you're sort of, if you're just thinking about what is this going to do for me, yeah, you could run the risk of maybe slightly keeping off somebody who's just really busy. And if you make it clear that like you're not really thinking about, what they might care about, that's, I think, only the little danger point. But I think most people, like you were saying, most people would be enthusiastic to chat with young scientists and brainstorm.
Real quick, I had a quick, more functional point, which was that to that end, you can make things very easy on the people that you're asking to introduce you to others. A nice trick is, even though LinkedIn, I think, is kind of a cesspool, you can look through someone's connections before you even reach out to them, see who are the people there that might interest you, or even a connection of a connection if you feel like, I know that they really know this person, and just tell them, please point me to them about this, and make it really easy on them if they are more senior, if they are very busy. And I also want to echo that people are really enthusiastic now. If you go to an interview and someone asks you if you want a glass of water, you should say yes, because people love helping others, and it gives them, I don't know, you're the neuroscientist here, but things fire off that make people smile. So I would really encourage you to kind of look for that better nature in people, because it's there.
I have a question about industry.
Okay.
I don't know the volume of this.
Yeah, same. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Great. Question about industry, and this is my perception, but perhaps it's wrong. For fMRI industry positions, it seems like they're a dime a dozen, very rare. It feels like neuro is still very much in the small molecule space.
Yeah.
And as someone who's considering both academia and also industry, if I were moving to industry, I would really like to stay in the fMRI world. But one, it seems like there's not a lot, and two, the positions that I am seeing, I think they're very high level, like principal investigator. Is there any like suggestion or way that you found jobs that pertain to fMRI, or how you found your job, or really anything about these positions at all?
Yeah, so this is a good question, because industry kind of just changes. So, 5 years ago when I was, thinking of leaving academia, and eventually did, there were a lot of, I would say neuroimaging. So I'm not gonna focus on fMRI, but neuroimaging type positions out there. Medical imaging was really hot. We thought we would replace radiologists with AI, right? Deep learning. And there are a number of these like small startup companies that had been started. Interest rates were really low, so like money was free. And and so yeah, there were so many. It was like booming economy. Now, for my second attempt at, most recent job hunt, there are a lot fewer imaging companies in general, right? So now fMRI is like really small. I do know one, we'll talk later. But I will say, so there's a few. Okay, we'll talk later. But it's a very different space now. Like right now, the LLMs are really hot right now. Everyone's trying to like incorporate AI, just using quotes. It's like, what is it? I don't. Anyway, there's that's the buzzword, right? And so it might just be timing, right? You might not see a lot of fMRI things right now, and maybe if they're there, it's principal scientists. And in that case, yeah, PhD, postdoc, and then you could be, qualified for that role. It could just be, maybe find something very similar, like imaging, or maybe it's not like MRI, but like just medical imaging in general. And then just kind of like be aware and just keep always looking on the cesspool that is LinkedIn. get those alerts.
Would you say that it's smaller because imaging is very expensive and because it's a bit riskier, like clinical imaging?
Yeah, it's a bit risky. I will say that, at my previous company, one thing we really struggled with was taking what we were doing in research and just like convincing people that it was worth doing in a clinical setting, right? So fMRI is a great example, the longer you spend that scanner, depending on certain conditions, you get a better, result. But in a clinical setting, time is money, right? And so, in my example, the types of sequences we were running for people with MS, we would keep people in the scanner for an hour and a half. I had beautiful data, right? Well, a ton of beautiful data. But in a clinical setting, if you have MS, you have 30 minutes max in that scanner. Like that's end to end. So maybe only 20 minutes in that scanner. So now the types of data you're getting are different. And so it can be really hard to be like, hey, imaging center, can you please do this really nice sequence that it's going to add a diffusion sequence, another 10 minutes? We're like, no, why would we do that, right? The other problem is like, oh, hey, radiologist, do you mind like not getting paid for this read so that the computer can do it for you? No, like that's not gonna work. So I will say that kind of this translational imaging, taking what we do in research and bringing it to like the like community clinics is just hard because like there's not really an incentive and maybe we're not selling it right. So I think for that reason, it's just been hard to like break in to that type of healthcare. So this is again, N of one company, but that's just kind of the feeling I'm getting that it's really hard to like break into the American healthcare system. Yeah. Yeah.
So, with all that being true, if looking for another job, is there a way you would suggest how to position your neuroimaging skills for another job and a job interview?
Yeah, I mean, it really is focusing on the more general aspects. So for me, it was data visualization. And so because of the open science thing, right? Like I was very open. I had a personal website I could point people to and say, hey, like, look at my figures, or look at this app that I built. And so just to be able to show your work and painting it in a way that's more generalized, right? Like I'm used to big data, like the protein engineering job I have right now. They generate a lot of data. It's a bunch of like words, like sequences of amino acids, but you can actually fold them and get a cool like 3D structure. And so I can say, I actually have a lot of experience visualizing 3D structures because I do that with the brain, So little things like that where you can just kind of just think about what you do in a more general sense. And then just be really open about it, shamelessly open about it.
Key.
Yeah. Anyone think
There's
oh,
Other question over here?
thought I saw a hand up over here.
No? Well, anyone else have a question? Yeah, thank you.
oh, yeah.
Shuffle this across.
Hi, it hopefully is on, but.
No, it's off again.
A token thing to hold.
Yeah, just attention.
Yeah.
Always a practice. But yeah, so I'm gonna kind of revert to I guess 2 questions before this, the networking related, I have an extension to it. So I think so far, because of my fairly multidisciplinary background, I've amassed connections that are weirdly like in like neuroscience and developmental psychology and academia, all the way to like child welfare policy. And I mean, obviously they all relate in my head and the work that I'm doing, but I think that being said, I found myself wondering, are there typical best practices for keeping in touch with said contacts when they really, really straddle multiple fields? Because, I mean, I have friends who send newsletters, so that feels a bit self-aggrandizing for me. I don't really know if I would do that, but I mean, I respect that. But, trying to figure out, like, given that I think in many ways, all of you, and I think most people in general have different multidisciplinary approaches to life, how you've kept in touch with people throughout your career, even though they might be from very, very, very different fields and might not use LinkedIn or any other site necessarily.
This recently happened to me. Okay, so networking, right? I know, a lot of people in neuroimaging, and so someone reached out to me, like my postdoc friend reached out to me, her student wants to come to America and do, something. So she was like, oh, you know a lot of people. And I'm like, yeah, sure. So I look up and I find my friend who I haven't emailed in 5-6 years. And I felt terrible about this. She sent me an email and I totally forgot to respond to it. And I was sweating. I was like, oh my God, she hates me now, right? Because I haven't kept in touch with her. I didn't even respond to her email. Like, this is terrible, but I was like, suck it up, be shameless. So I was just like, hey, I'm so sorry. Like, I didn't follow up. I hope that worked out. Also, here's life is good for me. Here's pictures of my kids. I don't know, trying to like smooth it over. And yeah, she was fine. She was like, and she talked to the person I was trying to network and everything was fine. So I think that people don't mind if you don't keep in touch with them. But when you do reach out, be kind and friendly and give them little mini life updates or talk about the time you did X, Y, and Z. And I don't know. I don't think you really need to like keep in touch with everybody because that's a lot. It's like, that's a big problem. Yeah.
I completely agree. I definitely don't think you need to force it. You can think of this as any other relationship in your life, any other friendship. If all of your friends were sending you life updates every month, that would be a lot. Like you wouldn't necessarily want to keep that friend in your life. But yeah, I think it's just, there's a bit of just using sort of common social sense about how to be in touch with people and not necessarily forcing it. I think just because it's a career context doesn't mean that you have to really change the rules and make things and force anything. I'll say, if there are conferences and someone's in the area that you're visiting, you might consider reaching out. Or if they're at the conference, then you could naturally bump into them or say, let's grab coffee, or are you going to be at the poster session? That's one of my favorite things. Are you going to be at the poster session or at this talk? Because I will be there anyways. So I might as well run into people there. I'd say like from my startup, there were a few of us, the main like central executive team that wanted to keep in touch with each other's lives. And we would maybe at first we would call a couple times a year, and now we call each other once a year. And yeah, there's nothing needed to force it. Just like, would you guys all like to chat? I'd love to hear how things are going. Or like maybe somebody will send Christmas card and you can see how their families are doing. But yeah, I feel like it's very like, if you just try to keep being social in some of these avenues, if you're on Twitter, then your academic Twitter friends will already see you. You'll feel kind of like there's a social connection. If you go to conferences and you go to the things, then you'll see some people there too. Besides that, again, yeah, it might be different in different contexts, but what I see in academia is not as forced, I think, in some of these ways.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. You could see me nodding. Yeah, I mean, with my academic network, I mean, a lot of them, hopefully a lot of your academic network are not just colleagues or peers you had at some time, but sort of friends, right? Or truly friends. And so I do think about those connections in very similar ways. It's like, sure, if I'm thinking about something, maybe somebody I haven't talked to in a while, or an old mentor, and I'm having like a memory, or just like really feeling grateful for something that, I got during that training period with them. There might be times where I might just go out of my way to reach out and just say that, the way I might do that for somebody that a friend that is just in a social context, but it doesn't feel inherently different from how I would handle the rest of my social relationships. And yeah, I do find social media or Twitter can be a nice way to just like, you mutually get to keep up with people, but not everybody's on that. So yeah, I think just reaching out at conferences, definitely like being like, hey, are you gonna be there? Like, let's grab coffee, let's grab a drink, or like something like that is always great.
Oh, go to you.
Oh,
Yeah,
I was just gonna say, if it doesn't naturally come to you to be a little extra social, I think we were talking, you have more kind of a social sort of personality. If it doesn't come naturally to you, being a little bit, just pushing yourself like a little bit to go to some of the more social things or meeting up with people, but you definitely don't have to like go out really outside your comfort zone that much. Like just a little bit, I think is fine.
Yeah, I want to point out also what I do is I'm a lurker on social media because I'm never going to post anything, but I will like that person's random LinkedIn post or whatever. Just I'm around. Yeah, hey, I see you. Like
I really want to echo what you said earlier around, they're not really going to take exception to the fact that you didn't reach out, but once you do, doing it in good faith and being professional within the connection is way more important across any connection you might have. And I would also recommend, don't do any Irish exits from place that you work. It's always not Irish exit is like leaving without saying goodbye. Sorry. But you should just say goodbye. Hey, Kamara, I'm sorry,
Not even true.
Oh.
Linger when they're going, I don't know.
We'll have to,
Spend half an hour to leave, like, talk to everyone on the way out, so.
oh, that's terrible. Well. Yeah, I'll play my idioms. Just don't leave without saying goodbye. That's the best way. That's the best way of putting it, because we had somebody leave for the industry recently in our center, not recently, maybe about a year ago in our center. And they just wrote a short email saying, hey, it's been real, really appreciate it. They said something nice about everybody on our team, which is a little odd at first, we're a 6-person team. It's very unconventional, but we really appreciated it. And we're doing some interviews of past engineers, and in reaching back out to this person, that's the first thing that comes to mind for me. And just saying goodbye can make such a big difference, because then if you do reach out 5-6 years later, somebody, even the last text, even if the last text in their phone from you is something like, okay, sweet, this is my last day, you're like, oh, that's dope. Okay, now I want to respond to such and such.
I have something, I know, I'm adding so many.
Pictures. I'll
So many
forget,
positives.
That's okay, I'll just pretend. I just wanted to add up, I think that's something that's related to that is trying to keep kind of a positive rather than a negative impression. So as much as possible, especially when you're first kind of meeting people, it's nice to try not to like get into the negative gossip side, share negative gossip, or kind of say things that might make people feel like you're a person who says negative things. It's very, very subtle, but you might start, if you met somebody like that and they immediately started gossiping something that's kind of like a little bit negative, it gives you, it could give an impression like, oh, that's a person who, like, you never know whether that person knows somebody or they have different opinions than you do, or just like doesn't like gossip. You just don't know. So it's good to always sort of keep the first impressions a little bit more positive until you know everybody a little bit more. And I think that's true for any social interaction.
Okay, so it's now 5 o'clock and we have on the schedule a networking event. Notice the networking event is really just where we have pizza and you can come ask these questions. If you notice me checking my phone occasionally, it's because we're trying to debug where the pizza is. Oh, and I think it's right here.
Oh.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. Let's thank our speakers. This has been amazing. And also the pizza delivery person. Panelists, if you can hang around for a little bit, I'm sure they'll have questions for you one-on-one. But the rest of this is just time for us to kind of socialize and meet each other and network and be shameless, I suppose. Have one of the time. So thank you.